The first thing I heard that morning was the metallic clank of a chain, a sound that did not belong. It was 6:42 a.m. on a Thursday in October. The air held the first real chill of autumn, sharp and clean, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. I was standing at the kitchen sink of my father's house in my house. Now I had to keep reminding myself of letting the hot water run over my hands, waiting for the coffee maker to finish its gurgling cycle. My father's funeral had been on Monday. The 3 days since had been a blur of quiet sorting, of touching objects that were once his, and feeling the cold absence of his presence. I looked out the window over the sink. The long gravel drive that led from the county road to the ranch house was bisected by a new, ugly scar. A 10-foot section of chain-link fence, anchored by freshly pounded metal posts. In the center of it was a gate, also chain-link, and a woman was threading a heavy-duty chain through the latch. She wore a bright pink tracksuit, the kind that seemed aggressively cheerful for this hour of the morning. I recognized her immediately. Carol Matheson, president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. I turned off the water, dried my hands on a dish towel, and poured coffee into my father's old ceramic mug, the one with a faded picture of a trout on the side. I did not rush. I walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped onto the wide wooden porch. The cold air was a shock, but I welcomed it. It felt clarifying. Carol finished padlocking the gate. She gave the chain a satisfying, theatrical tug, then turned, a smug little smile on her face. She saw me standing there, and her smile widened, becoming a mask of patronizing authority. "A good morning, Arthur," she called out, her voice carrying easily in the still air. It was a voice accustomed to being heard, to giving orders. Just getting things secured. "Don't you worry." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The steam warmed my face. I said nothing. My silence seemed to unnerve her more than an argument would have. Her smile tightened. This is official HOA business," she announced, gesturing to the fence as if it were a monument. This access point has become a liability. We have had reports of non-residents using it. For the safety and security of the community, the board voted to permanently close it. From now on, you will need to use the main entrance to the estates like everyone else. Down the drive. My drive, the drive my grandfather had cut with a mule and a plow 100 years ago. It connected the original ranch property directly to the old county road. Quote, "The main entrance to the estancia was a 3-mile detour through a labyrinth of cul-de-sacs and identical houses with names like the Aspina and the Willow. My father had sold the acreage for that development 20 years ago, but he had kept the original ranch house, the barns, and this 50-acre parcel surrounding it. He had also very specifically kept this drive." Carol," I said, my voice flat. This is private property. This is my driveway," she laughed, a short, sharp bark. "Oh, Arthur. I know you're grieving, and we all feel for you. We really do. But your father's passing doesn't it change the covenants, conditions, and restrictions? This road has been used by residents for years, for walking their dogs and for overflow parking during our community events. ATOS become a common area through historic use. A prescriptive easement, our lawyer called it. The board has simply formalized it. It is all above board." She patted one of the metal posts. "Aware sending you the bill for your half of the installation cost. It'll be added as a special assessment to your account." I looked at the fresh dirt piled around the base of the posts, scarring the grass on either side of my driveway. I looked at the shiny, galvanized steel of the fence, glinting in the early morning sun. I looked at the industrial-grade padlock she had just snapped shut. Then I looked at her, at the supreme, unshakable confidence in her eyes. The confidence of a person who has only ever bullied their way to victory, who believes that their will, stated loudly and with enough conviction, can literally reshape the world around them. She believed the fence was a fact. She believed the lock was an ending. I took another sip of coffee. I lowered the mug and met her gaze. She had no idea. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. She saw a grieving son, a quiet man in his late 50s, who had just inherited a piece of land she coveted for her suburban kingdom. She saw a problem she could solve with a fence and a fine. She had no idea that for 35 years, my entire professional life had been about fences and fines, about boundaries and documents, about rules and their precise, unyielding application. She had no idea that in her triumphant act of aggression, she had not closed a gate. She had opened a file. And my files were tombs. She had no idea that she had just spent HOA money to build a beautiful, sturdy, and legally documented piece of evidence on my behalf. She had just handed me Exhibit A. But before I tell you what I did next, I should probably explain. This was not about a fence. It was never just about a fence. It was about a fundamental difference in how two people see the world. And it had started long before that Thursday morning. My name is Arthur Finch. For 35 years, I was a partner at a downtown firm specializing in land use, water rights, and contract law. My job, in essence, was to read the things that nobody else wanted to read. I read 1,000-page environmental impact reports. I read century-old deeds written in elegant looping cursive. I read municipal codes so dense and boring they could be used as a sedative. I lived in a world of paper, of precise language, of clauses and subclauses and notarized signatures. My late wife Eleanor used to joke that I could find a loophole in the 10 Commandments. She was a painter. She saw the world in color, in light, in emotion. I saw it in black and white, in typeface, in binding agreements. We balanced each other. After I lost her to cancer 5 years ago, the world of paper was all I had left. It was orderly. It made sense. A contract was a contract. A boundary line was a boundary line. There was a comforting finality to it. My father, Thomas Finch, was a different kind of man. He was as solid and quiet as the granite hills behind the ranch. He worked the land, not because he had to, but because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. He understood the world through seasons, through the feel of the soil, through the way the creek rose in the spring. He was a man of handshakes and his word being his bond. When the developers came 20 years ago wanting to buy up the pasture land that bordered the growing town, he drove a hard bargain. But he was fair. He sold them 300 acres, land that was becoming difficult for him to manage alone as he got older. The sale made him comfortable for the rest of his life. But he was adamant about what he kept. The house his grandfather built, the main barn, and the 50 acres immediately surrounding it, including the long, straight driveway to the old county road. The development Whispering Pines Estates grew up around his property like a fungus. The houses were large, beige, and packed tightly together. The original Whispering Pines my father had loved were mostly cut down to make way for sod lawns and ornamental pear trees that dropped smelly fruit all over the sidewalks. With the development came the Homeowners Association. At first, it was a simple, practical thing. They managed the new communal septic system, arranged for trash pickup, and maintained the new paved roads. My father was a good neighbor. He paid his dues even though his property was technically an island within their geography, not a part of it. He let kids cut across a corner of his land to get to the school bus stop. When the HOA wanted to have a 4th of July picnic, he let them use the edge of his big hayfield for parking. He was from a generation that believed in community. He saw neighbors, not potential litigants. That all changed about 6 years ago, when Carol Matheson was elected HOA president. Carol and her husband had moved from some gated community in Southern California. She brought with her a militant devotion to aesthetic uniformity. She was a performative tyrant. Her power was derived from public shaming and the weaponization of trivial rules. She had a gift for making her personal preferences sound like immutable laws of nature. The HOA meetings, which had once been sleepy affairs, became her stage. I started hearing about it from my father on our Sunday calls. Old Mrs. Gable, a widow in her 80s, was fined $200 because her bird feeder was attracting undesirable birds only. Jays. Henderson was cited because his mailbox, which was perfectly functional, was a shade of forest green. That was no longer on the approved color palette. Corral's reign was a slow-motion avalanche of petty grievances and escalating fines. People who had been friends for a decade started eyeing each other with suspicion. The HOA became her personal enforcement squad. Her attention turned to my Fedora's property about 4 years ago. It started with the kindnesses he had extended. The path the kids used to take to the bus stop was now an unauthorized trila that lowered property values. He received a formal letter demanding he fence it off. He did. The hayfield he'd let them use for parking. He received a notice that the HOA would be formalizing the existing parking arrangement and would be graveling a portion of it. That was the first time I had to step in. I wrote a polite, simple letter on my firmest letterhead, pointing out that permissive use does not establish an easement, that any attempt to alter his property would be considered trespassing. There was a brief, simmering silence after that. But Carol was not one to be deterred by facts. She simply changed her angle of attack. She began to focus on the driveway, my father's driveway. She started referring to it as the West Access Road. She put it on the HOA maps she drew up. She encouraged residents to use it, framing it as a community amenity, that stubborn old man Finch was a hoarding she was planting a seed, creating a narrative. My father, a man who hated conflict, started getting notes left on his door. Anonymous complaints about the dust his truck kicked up. Demands that he grade the road for their convenience. It was then that I started a file. I was still living in the city, an hour away, but I was visiting every other weekend. I bought a small, sturdy accordion folder. On the tab, I wrote a Matheson. Every notice my father received, I photocopied and filed. Every passive-aggressive email she sent to the A community, which my father was on the mailing list for, I printed and filed. I advised my father to pay one of her ridiculous, baseless Finisa $50 penalty for his grass being a half-inch too long near the property line. He was furious. Scortion, Arthur, he'd said. I know, Dad, I told him. Pay it. Send a check, keep a copy. Why should I? Because it creates a record. It establishes you as a member in their system. It gives you standing. Right now this is just a game to her. We need to play by the rules, all of them. Especially hers, so he paid it. I kept the receipt. I kept every receipt. I documented every interaction when a neighbor, Mr. Rockin Henderson of the wrong-colored mailbox fame, told me that Carol had bragged at a board meeting about how she was going to eventually acquire the driveway for the community. I had him write it down, sign it, and date it. It went into the folder. The folder grew thicker. It was my quiet, methodical habit. In my line of work, you learn that memory is fallible, and emotion is a liability. The only thing that endures, the only thing that has weight, in a dispute, is the paper trail. On paper, Carol Matheson was building a magnificent case against herself. She just didn't know it. My father's health declined over the last year. I moved into the ranch house to take care of him. Carol saw my presence as an escalation. She saw my quiet, city-dweller demeanor as a weakness. The notices became more frequent, more demanding. I ignored most of them, simply adding them to the folder, which now required a second accordion file. My focus was on my father. The petty squabbles of the HOA felt like buzzing flies in a world that had shrunk to the size of his bedroom. When he passed, I was consumed by the logistics of death. The funeral home, the will, the endless notifications. I was in a fog of grief and paperwork. Carol must have seen it as the perfect opportunity. The old man was gone. The soft-spoken son was distracted. The throne was empty. It was time to make her move. So there I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, watching her preen in front of her newly erected monument to arrogance. The fence was a declaration of war. She thought it was the final move in her long game, checkmate. What she failed to understand was that for me, this was not a game. It was a matter of procedure. And the procedure was just beginning. I finished my coffee, went back inside, and closed the door. I didn't shout. I didn't make a scene. I walked to the small office my father had kept, a room that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. On the desk was a stack of sympathy cards and a pile of bills. I pushed them aside. I went to the filing cabinet in the corner, a heavy, steel-gray piece of furniture from the 1972nd. I opened the bottom drawer, and I took out the two thick accordion files labeled a Matheson. I placed them squarely in the center of the desk. Then I sat down in my father's worn leather chair, took a deep breath, and got to work. The first step in any conflict resolution is to remove emotion and establish a baseline of undisputed fact. My baseline was the 50 acres of land, the house, and the driveway. I needed to re-verify every single document pertaining to them. I knew, intellectually, that the property was mine, free and clear. My father had left it to me in his will. A simple, ironclad document I had drafted for him myself a decade prior. But intellectual knowledge was sound enough. I needed the paper. I needed the official, stamped, recorded, undeniable truth. I spent the rest of that Thursday in the office. I didn't answer the phone. I didn't check my email. I created a chronological timeline of every interaction with Carol and the HOA, cross-referencing my notes with the documents in the Matheson file. The narrative that emerged was damning. A clear pattern of harassment, of overreach, of a slow, methodical attempt to claim property through intimidation. Her claim of a prescriptive easement was laughable. A prescriptive easement requires that the use of the property be a hostile, meaning without the owner's permission. My father's kindness, his permissive use for the picnic and the bus stop path, was the very thing that legally prevented her claim from having any merit. She had taken his generosity and tried to twist it into a weapon against him. On paper it was an open and shut case of a failed legal argument. But I knew Carol. This would not be one on the merits of a single legal doctrine. She operated in the court of public opinion and petty bureaucracy. I needed to dismantle her entire power structure. That meant not just proving her wrong about the driveway, but proving her unfit to lead. On Friday morning I drove into town, not to the local courthouse. Not yet. My first stop was a small copy shop. I spent 2 hours methodically duplicating every single document in the Matheson file. The originals went back into the filing cabinet. The copies became my working file. I organized them into a 3-ring binder with tabbed dividers. Correspondence, financial, photographic evidence, witness statements. My next stop was the county recorder's office. It was a familiar place, a quiet, dusty library of deeds and plats. I greeted the clerk, a woman named Doris I had known for 20 years, and got to work. I pulled the original plat map for the Whispering Pines Estates development, filed in 1998. I spread the large, crackling document on a lighted table. There it was in clear, precise Serviora's ink. My father's 50-acre parcel was outlined with a thick border, clearly marked, not a part of this plat, and the driveway, my driveway, was explicitly labeled a private access easement for parcel 7B, with my father's name right next to it. The document that created her entire community also explicitly excluded my property from its dominion. I had the clerk make me 3 certified copies of the plat map. One for my file, one for my lawyer, and one for Carol. My last act before leaving town was to draft a letter. I didn't use my old firm's letterhead. I used plain, personal stationery. The letter was simple, direct, and devoid of emotion. It stated 3 facts. 1, that she had illegally erected a fence on my private property, a fact confirmed by the enclosed certified copy of the master plat. 2, that this constituted trespassing and property damage. 3, that she had until 5 p.m. the following Monday to have the fence and all associated materials removed and the ground restored to its original condition. If she failed to do so, I would have it removed myself and would pursue all available legal and civil remedies to recover the costs, including damages. I sent the letter via 2 methods. First, an email with a read receipt request, with the documents attached as a PDF. Second, and more importantly, I sent a physical copy via certified mail, return receipt, requested. This was critical. The little green card that would come back to me with her signature on it would be proof that she had received the warning. It would be another sheet of paper for the binder. I spent the weekend in a state of calm, focused clarity. The grief for my father was still a heavy weight in my chest, but the familiar process of building a case was a strange comfort. It was a problem I knew how to solve. While Carol was likely crowing to her neighbors about how she'd finally tamed the wild ranch on their border, I was quietly laying bricks of evidence, building a wall of facts she would never be able to climb. On Monday afternoon, the mail carrier delivered the certified mail receipt. Her signature, a spiky, arrogant scrawl, was right there on the green card. I slid it into a plastic sleeve and clipped it into my binder. The 5 p.m. deadline came and went. The fence remained. The lock remained. I received no reply to my email, though the read receipt confirmed she had opened it at 9:14 a.m. that morning. Her silence was her answer. She was calling my bluff. She believed that possession was 10/10 of the law, and that the physical reality of the fence superseded any piece of paper I could wave at her. She had no idea that I never bluff. On Tuesday morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a fencing contractor. I explained the situation and asked them to be on standby. The second was to my old paralegal, a woman named Maria Rodriguez. Maria had worked with me for 30 years. She was sharper than most lawyers I knew, and fiercely loyal. Arthur, she said, her voice warm, but concerned. I was so sorry to hear about your father. Are you holding up a managing, Maria? Thank you. Listen, I have a personal matter. It's an HOA dispute. I could hear her smile through the phone. HOA dispute. Arthur, that is like sending a battleship to deal with a canoe. What did they do? I explained the situation with the fence. She was silent for a moment, then let out a low whistle. Ah, wow. She's got nerve. What do you need? I need you to do what you do best. I want you to pull everything you can find on the Whispering Pines Estates HOA and on a Carol Matheson. I want their articles of incorporation, their bylaws, their meeting minutes for the last 6 years if you can get them. I want property records for Carol Matheson. I want to know if she has a history of this. Check court records in this state and California. I want to know where every penny of their stated budget goes. I am overnighting you a binder with what I have so far. I want you to treat this like we are preparing for trial against a Fortune 500 company. Consider it done, Arthur," she said, the excitement evident in her voice. Maria loved a good paper chase. You just focus on the local end. Handle the deep dive. My local end involved a drive to a neighboring town and a meeting with an old friend, Ben Carter. Ben was a licensed surveyor, a man whose entire life was about the mathematical certainty of lines on the earth. I bought him lunch and laid out the plat map. Shay's claiming prescriptive use, I said. "Oh." Ben snorted on, "A deeded private easement. Shay's an idiot. What do you need me for? This is cut and dried. I need you to do a full survey of that boundary line," I said. "I want stakes driven, every 20 feet. I want it marked so clearly a child could see it." But there was something else. About 2 years ago, Carol had the HOA regrade a drainage ditch that runs along the north side of my property. They did it to divert water away from her prize-winning rose garden. My father complained about it, said it was causing erosion on his side, but he was too tired to fight. "I have a suspicion, Ben leaned in, his eyes lighting up. "What kind of suspicion?" "I suspect that to get the grade she wanted, her new ditch had to cross the property line, not by much, maybe just a few inches. But I want you to find out. I want you to measure the exact location of that ditch relative to the legal boundary. I want it documented, photographed, and included in your official report." Ben grinned. "Oh, this is getting good. Wha? So you are not just proving where the line is. You are proving she already knew where the line was. And crossed it intentionally, for her own benefit." "Exactly," I said. "It moves her from ignorant to acting in bad faith. It demolishes any pretense of an honest mistake." "I can have a crew out there tomorrow morning," Ben said, folding the map. This is the most fun I've had all year." I went home that evening and felt a shift inside me. The fog of grief was beginning to lift, replaced by the sharp, cold clarity of purpose. Carol Matheson had intended to steal a piece of my family's history, a piece of my land. But what she was actually doing was giving me a reason to fight my way back to the world, one document at a time. I was no longer just sorting through my father's past, I was securing his legacy. The next morning, Wednesday, Ben's survey crew arrived. They were professional, efficient, and ignored the glares from neighbors peeking through their blinds. They worked for 6 hours, pounding in wooden stakes, topped with bright orange flags. The result was a stark, undeniable line, drawn across the landscape, running right along the edge of my driveway. The fence Carol had installed was revealed to be a full 5 feet inside my property line. The survey also confirmed my suspicion about the drainage ditch. Bias' report, which he emailed to me that evening, included photographs and precise measurements, showing the ditch encroached on my property by an average of 18 inches for a length of over 200 feet. This was the bombshell. Not a huge one, but a critical one. It was one thing to argue about a driveway that people had been informally using. It was another thing entirely to have hard, physical proof that the HOA president had personally directed an excavation project that crossed onto private land to protect her flower garden. One was a dispute over access, the other was theft of soil. I printed Ben's report and added it to the binder. The case was getting stronger, heavier. I felt the comforting weight of it in my hands. I had planned to call the fencing contractor on Thursday, but Carol, as was her habit, decided to escalate. And in doing so, she made a fatal error. She decided to involve the authorities. It was just after 9 a.m. on Thursday when I saw the sheriff's cruiser pull up to the locked gate. 2 deputies got out. Carol was right there to meet them, already in mid-performance. I saw her dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I saw her pointing, a trembling finger, at my house. She was playing the victim, a role she had perfected. I took a moment to prepare. I put on a clean, button-down shirt. I selected 3 documents from my binder: my driver's license, a certified copy of the property deed, and a copy of Banah's brand new survey map. I put them in a simple manila folder. Then I walked calmly down the drive to meet them. The 2 deputies were a study in contrasts. The older one, a sergeant by his stripes, had a weary seen-it-all look on his face. The younger one was sharp-eyed, watchful, his expression neutral. "And he's been threatening me, officer," Carol was saying, her voice thick with fake emotion. "I am in fear for my safety. He's a recluse, a very strange man. We put up this security fence to protect the community from intruders, and has trying to tear it down. He says it is his land, but this has been community access for 20 years. The older deputy turned to me. His eyes were tired but intelligent. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Miller. This is Deputy Evans. We received a call from MS Matheson here regarding a property dispute." "A good morning, Sergeant," I said quietly. "My name is Arthur Finch." "This is my property, Adea, that's a lie," Carol shrieked. "Ita's HOA. Common area." Sergeant Miller held up a hand, silencing her without even looking at her. He kept his eyes on me. "AMS. Matheson claims this is HOA property, and you have threatened her over this fence." "I have not threatened her," I said calmly. I sent her a formal letter, via certified mail, informing her that she had illegally constructed a fence on my private property. She did not respond. "Aha, a lawyer," Carol spat, as if it were an accusation of a terrible crime. "Aha's trying to use legal mumbo-jumbo to steal our road." The younger deputy, Evans, shifted his weight slightly. It was a small tell, but I saw it. A flicker of skepticism in his eyes. He was watching the dynamic, weighing the performance against my quiet statement of fact. "Sir, do you have any documentation to support your claim of ownership?" Sergeant Miller asked. "I do," I said. I didn't hand him a mountain of paper. I didn't overwhelm him. I gave him only what he needed. I handed him my driver's license to confirm my identity and the certified copy of the deed. He took them, his eyes scanning the deed. It was a simple, 1-page document, clearly stating that the 50-acre parcel, including all structures and access routes, belonged to the Finch Family Trust, of which I was the sole trustee. He read it slowly. The silence stretched. "This seems pretty straightforward, sir," he said, his tone shifting almost imperceptibly. He handed the deed back to me. "This document states the property is yours. But the prescriptive easement," Carl insisted, her voice getting shrill. "Oh." His voice was patient but firm. "A prescriptive easement is a civil matter. It takes something a judge has to decide. What I have here is a legal deed. On paper, this is his land. That makes this a civil dispute. There is nothing for us to do here." "So he can just tear down our fence?" she demanded, aghast. "If the fence is on his property, Mom, he can do what he likes with it. Just as if I parked my car in your driveway. You could have it towed." "You cannot block access to a man's property." I decided to add one more layer. For the record, officers," I said, holding up the survey map so they could both see it clearly. "I had a licensed survey completed yesterday. The orange stakes mark the legal property line. As you can see, the fence is not on the line. It is 5 feet inside my property. For the purpose of your report, I would like to state that I am formally identifying MS. Carol Matheson as the individual who has directed the installation of an illegal structure on my property, parcel number 7B. I am also stating that she is refusing to remove it. Deputy Evans took out his notepad. He clicked his pen. Could you repeat that parcel number for me, sir?" he asked. I repeated it. He wrote it down. He wrote down Carol's name. He wrote down my statement. He was creating a public record, an official police report documenting my version of events. Carol watched, her mouth agape. She had called them here to be her muscle, to intimidate me. Instead, they were taking my statement, creating a piece of evidence against her. "So you are not going to arrest him," she stammered. Sergeant Miller sighed. A long, weary exhalation. "Mom, for the last time. This is a civil matter. You need to talk to your lawyer. My advice," he added, lowering his voice slightly, "is to have him look at this deed and that survey very carefully. Have a good day, sir," he said to me, with a slight nod. He and Deputy Evans got back in their cruiser. As they pulled away, I saw Deputy Evans look at me in the rearview mirror. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was a small gesture of solidarity from one world of rules and procedures to another. He recognized the language of documents, of facts, and he had just seen it triumph over a performance of hysterics. Carol stood there, stunned into silence. Her face, which had been a mask of righteous victimhood, was now slack with disbelief. The cavalry had arrived, looked at the battlefield, and declared her to be on the wrong side. Her most powerful weapon, her ability to summon authority to enforce her will, had not only failed, it had backfired. She had intended to create a police report documenting my aggression. Instead, she had created one documenting hers. She turned her gaze on me. The fake tears were gone. The victimhood was gone. Her eyes were cold, hard points of fury. "You will regret this, Arthur," she said, her voice a low hiss. "You have no idea what you have just started." I simply looked at her, then at the fence, then back at her. "Oh, I think I do, Carol," I said, for the first time allowing a sliver of the immense, cold confidence I felt to show awe. "I think I know exactly what I have started." I turned and walked back to my house, leaving her standing alone by her useless gate. The ball was in her court, but she had no idea the court was one I had designed and whose rules I had written. The encounter with the sheriff's deputies was a turning point. It was a public failure for Carol, and news in a community like Whispering Pines travels fast. Whispers turn into phone calls turn into front yard conversations. The narrative she had so carefully crafted of the brave HOA president protecting the community from a hostile reclusia had developed a fatal crack. That evening, I got a phone call. The number was blocked. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. "Is this Arthur Finch?" a man's voice asked, low and hesitant. It is. Who is this?" This is George Henderson." I recognized the name immediately, Mr. Henderson. The man with the non-compliant mailbox. The one who had given me the signed statement about Carola's intentions years ago. Mr. Henderson," I said. "It's good to hear from you. Is everything all right? I heard what happened today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "With the sheriff. My neighbor Betty. She saw the whole thing. She said you had paperwork." She said Carol looked like she'd been struck by lightning. The deputies confirmed it was a civil matter and that the fence is on my property," I said, keeping my tone neutral. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, the sound of a man wrestling with a decision. "Mr. Fincher, Arthera, I have something that might help you. I was always too afraid. Carol can be very vindictive. You know how she is? But what she did to your father, and now this it's not right, This was the moment, the appearance of the fearful ally in every battle against a bully. There are dozens of silent victims. All it takes is for one of them to see a real chance of winning. And they might just find their voice. What is it, George?" I asked gently. After she fined me for the mailbox, I started recording the audio of the HOA board meetings on my phone. Just for my own protection. I have a recording of the executive session from 3 months ago. The one where she proposed the West Access Road Security Project, ADES, what she called it. My hand tightened on the phone. This was gold. Meeting minutes could be altered, sanitized. An audio recording was pure, as she told the board that your father was getting frail, and that once he was gone, it would be the perfect time to reclaim the road for the community. She said you were just a city lawyer who wouldn't want the hassle of a fight. She said, and I am quoting here, "Oh, we just have to be bold and act decisively. Once the fence is up, what is he going to do? The legal fight will cost him thousands. He give up." The treasurer, a man named Frank. He asked if the HOA's lawyer had actually approved this. She got very defensive. She said the lawyer gave her the term, a prescriptive easement, and told her it was a strong potential argument. She presented that to the board as a green light. My mind was racing. This was more than I could have hoped for. The recording proved premeditation. It proved intent. It proved she knew her legal standing was, at best, a potential argument, not a certainty, and that she had intentionally misled her own board. It painted a clear picture of her bad faith. George," I said, "that recording is an incredibly important piece of evidence. Would you be willing to share it with me?" "I'll do more than that," he said, his voice gaining a measure of strength. "I'll testify to it, under oath. I am sick and tired of being afraid of that woman. What she's doing is wrong. Ita's a land grab pure and simple, and she's using our dues to fund it." We arranged to meet the next day. He brought me a USB stick with the audio file. He looked like a man who had just shed a tremendous weight. We sat at my kitchen table, and I listened to the recording. It was exactly as Haid described. Carol's confident, dismissive voice, the hesitant questioning from the treasurer, the eventual, reluctant vote of approval from a board that was clearly under her thumb. As George was leaving, another car pulled into the driveway, stopping just short of the fence. It was a modest sedan. Man in his late 60s got out. I recognized him from photos. Frank Miller, the HOA treasurer. The disillusioned insider. He saw George and gave a nervous nod. "Georgia," he said. "Arthur. I figured I might find you here." Frank looked tired. He was holding a thin accordion file of his own. "I cannot do it anymore, Arthur," he said, without preamble. "I was the treasurer who questioned the fence. I voted against it, but she had the other 3 board members in her pocket. After the sheriff came yesterday, I went through the financials. She never got formal approval for the expenditure for that fence. She used funds from the General Road Maintenance Reserve, claiming it was a traffic control device. It is a violation of our bylaws. She paid the contractor in cash from a secondary account. It is all here." He held out the file. "These are copies of the unapproved invoices and the internal budget transfers. She's been cooking the books for years, hiding her pet projects in broad strokes budget categories. This fence is just the most blatant example. I am resigning from the board, effective immediately. And giving this to you. Do with it what you will." In the space of a few hours, my solitary case had transformed. It was no longer just Arthur Finch versus Carol Matheson. A coalition was forming. I now had a witness to her premeditated intent, and documentary proof of financial misconduct from her own treasurer. I had her cornered from a property law perspective, a procedural perspective, and now a financial one. That night, I received an email from Maria, my paralegal. The subject line was simply, a bingo. The body of the email was concise. Arthur, our lady has a history. Carol and Robert Matheson were defendants in a civil suit in Orange County, California, in 2012. It was a nearly identical fact pattern. An HOA dispute over a common wall. They built a structure, encroaching on a Nabarras property, claimed a adverse possession, and tried to bully the owner into submission. They lost. Badly. They were sanctioned by the court for bringing a frivolous claim and had to pay the other party's attorney's fees. It looks like they sold their house and left the state shortly after the judgment. I have attached the case file. She knows exactly what Shay's doing because Shay's done it before and lost. This is innate ignorance. It is a strategy, a failed strategy, but a strategy nonetheless. I opened the attached PDF. It was a 150-page case file. I read every word. Maria was right. It was the same playbook, the same arrogance, the same reliance on bluster over law, and the same outcome, a humiliating legal defeat. She was a serial abuser of process. I saved the file, printed a copy, and added it to the binder. The binder was now nearly 6 inches thick. It was no longer just a collection of documents, it was a biography of a crime. A meticulous, cross-referenced, undeniable story of one woman's greed and abuse of power. I knew what I had to do next. It was time to stop gathering evidence and start using it. But Carol had one last move to make. One final desperate act of escalation. On Friday morning, a man in a cheap suit knocked on my door and served me with a temporary restraining order. I took the papers calmly. It was a masterpiece of fiction. In the sworn declaration signed by Carol, under penalty of perjury, she claimed that I had been harassing her, that I had driven my truck up to the gate at high speed to intimidate her, that I had threatened her with physical violence, and that I was a danger to the community. It was all lies, easily disproven. But in the world of TROs, the bar for a temporary order is shockingly low. A judge, seeing the wild accusations, had granted it on an emergency basis pending a full hearing. The hearing was scheduled for the following Wednesday. The order stipulated that I was not to come within 100 yards of Carol Matheson and, most critically, that I was restrained from altering, damaging, or removing the fence in question until the hearing. She had finally found a way to use the law to her advantage. She had weaponized the system designed to protect people from harm to protect her illegally constructed fence. She had bought herself another week. She thought she had trapped me. I read the document, then I looked at the process server. "A thank you," I said, and closed the door. I walked back to my office and smiled. It was a cold, thin smile. She had no idea what a gift he had just given me. A temporary restraining order based on a sworn declaration, a declaration I could now prove, with police reports and witness testimony, was a complete fabrication. She had just committed perjury. And she had done it in a formal court filing. I picked up the phone and called my old law partner, David Chen. "David?" I said, "I need a litigator." The week leading up to the hearing was a blur of methodical preparation. David, a bulldog of a trial lawyer who delighted in dismantling bullies, took one look at my binder, and his eyes lit up. "Arthur," he said, "this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. You have gift-wrapped her head for me on a silver platter." We decided on a two-pronged strategy. First, we would demolish the temporary restraining order at the hearing. Second, immediately following that, we would file a comprehensive civil suit against Carol personally and against the Whispering Pines Estates HOA. The suit would seek damages for trespassing, property damage, slander of title, and legal fees. It would also seek an injunction to have the fence removed and a court order affirming my undisputed right to the private driveway. Finally, it would include a motion for sanctions against Carol for filing a frivolous and perjurious TRO. The community, meanwhile, was in an uproar. Franca's resignation from the board, coupled with George's newfound courage, had created a firestorm. The story of the California lawsuit, which Maria had discreetly allocated to a few key residents, spread like wildfire. The narrative had completely flipped. Carol was no longer the protector of the community. She was a serial litigator and a financial tyrant who had lied to them all. A special HOA meeting was called for the evening of the court hearing, forced by a petition circulated by George and Frank. The agenda: a vote of no confidence in Carol Mathesana's presidency. Her entire world was beginning to crumble, and the epicenter of the earthquake was a quiet courtroom scheduled for 2 p.m. on Wednesday. The courtroom was small and stuffy. Carol was there with a young, slick-looking lawyer who seemed more interested in his expensive suit than the case file. She sat ramrod straight, her face a mask of defiant confidence. She had her supporters with her, a handful of residents who were either true believers or too afraid to break ranks. On our side sat myself, David, George Henderson, and Frank Miller. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Esposito, called the case. This is the matter of Matheson versus Finch regarding a temporary restraining order. MS. Matheson, you are the petitioner. Please have your counsel proceed. A cross lawyer stood up and launched into a flowery speech about community safety, the vulnerability of his client, and the aggressive behavior of a hostile property owner. He painted a picture of me as a looming threat. Then, he called Carol to the stand. She was a consummate performer. She spoke in a trembling voice. She described my reckless driving. She claimed I had shouted threats at her. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue as she described her fear. It was a compelling performance. If you didn't know the facts, then it was David's turn to cross-examine. He approached her with a calm, almost gentle demeanor. Matheson, he began, you have testified under oath that my client, Mr. Finch, has been harassing you. Is that correct? Yes, constantly, she said. And you testified that he drove his truck at high speed towards the gate you had installed. Can you tell the court what day that happened? She hesitated. For a fraction of a second. Last Thursday. The day I called the sheriff, the day you called the sheriff, David repeated so. When the sheriff's deputies arrived, did you report this supposed threatening behavior to them? Yes, of course I did, she said, a little too quickly. David walked back to our table and picked up a document. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence as Defense Exhibit A, the official report from the Sheriff's Department regarding the call to Mr. Matter, Finch's property on that date. The judge reviewed the document. David continued. Matheson, this report, signed by Sergeant Miller and Deputy Evans, contains a detailed summary of their conversation with you. It mentions a property dispute. It mentions your claim of a prescriptive easement. It mentions Mr. Finch's deed. It contains no mention whatsoever of you reporting any threats, any harassment, or any reckless driving. Can you explain that discrepancy? Caralla's face went blank. The mask slipped. I must have told them. Maybe they did write it down or maybe David said, his voice hardening. Adaz, because it never happened. Is not it true, Miss Matheson, that the deputies informed you that you were in a civil dispute, that Mr. Finch's deed appeared valid, and that they could not assist you? They were very unhelpful, she muttered. David moved on. Ms. Matheson, are you familiar with a property dispute in Orange County, California, in 2012? Carroll's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance? It goes to a pattern of behavior and credibility, Your Honor, David said smoothly. The petitioner is claiming harassment. But I intend to prove she is the one with a history of using the legal system to harass property owners. Allow it, the judge said, her eyes narrowed on Carroll briefly. David presented the case file. He read the Judge's ruling from the California case, highlighting the sanctions for bringing a frivolous claim. Carroll sank a little lower in her chair. Finally, David went in for the kill. He held up a copy of Bennett's survey. Matheson, you claim this fence is a community safety feature on HOA common land. Is that right? Yes, she said weakly. Then, can you explain why this certified survey shows the fence is built 5 feet inside Mr. Fives' Finchay's property? And can you explain why this same survey shows a drainage ditch, which you ordered built, that encroaches on Mr. Finchay's property for over 200 feet? He let the question hang in the air. The room was silent. Carroll stared at the survey map as if it were a snake. She had no answer. She knew she was caught. Her entire case was built on the idea that she was acting in good faith on behalf of the community on community land. The survey proved she was acting in her own self-interest, on land she knew was not hers. The collapse was swift and total. Her face, which had been a canvas of shifting emotions, went completely still. It was the stillness of absolute defeat. She looked at her lawyer, but he just stared down at his legal pad, doodling. He knew it was over. Judge Esposito had seen enough. Counsel, she said, her voice dripping with ice, am dissolving this temporary restraining order, effective immediately. I am also finding that it was sought in bad faith and based on perjured testimony. I will be issuing sanctions against your client to cover Mr. Finch's legal fees for this hearing. Furthermore, I am taking the extraordinary step of referring this matter to the district attorney's office for an investigation into perjury. Ms. Matheson, your conduct in this courtroom and in the filing of this order is an appalling abuse of the judicial process. Do you understand me? Carroll just nodded a tiny spastic movement. She looked small, diminished. The performative tyrant had been stripped of her stage, her costume, and her script. All that was left was a woman who had been caught in a web of her own lies. We walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. It felt like walking out of a tomb. George Henderson was beaming. Frank Miller was shaking his head in quiet disbelief. I've never seen anything like it, Safte. Frank said, she just deflated. That is what happens when you build your house on a foundation of lies, I said. It only takes one fact to bring the whole thing down. Our work wasn't done. We had the HOA meeting that evening. The news of Carroll's spectacular defeat in court had already ripped through the community. When we arrived at the clubhouse, the room was packed. It was a completely different atmosphere from the tense, fearful meetings of the past. It felt energized, liberated. Carroll was there, sitting alone at the wildest table. Her supporters had vanished. She looked pale and drawn. The meeting was a formality. George Henderson stood up and read the motion for the vote of no confidence, citing the court's ruling, the financial misconduct documented by Frank, and the pattern of harassment against residents. When it came time for the vote, it was nearly unanimous. Carroll was stripped of her presidency and her position on the board. The room erupted in applause. It wasn't triumphant or cruel. It was relieved. It was the sound of a long, low-grade fever, finally breaking. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. The civil suit we filed was settled out of court almost immediately. The HOA ACE, insurance carrier, faced with the mountain of evidence we had, advised them to capitulate on every point. The HOA paid for the removal of the fence and for a landscaping company to restore the ground to its original condition. They paid my legal fees as stipulated in the settlement. And they issued a formal written apology, which was mailed to every resident. Carol Matheson was charged with perjury by the district attorney. She pleaded no contest and received a hefty fine and 2 years of probation. The financial fallout was even more severe. The HOA, under its new, saner leadership, headed by a reluctant but principled Frank Miller, conducted a full audit. They discovered years of financial mismanagement. To avoid a lawsuit from the HOA itself, Carol and her husband agreed to pay back over $50,000 in misappropriated funds. Their public humiliation was complete. Within 6 months, a for sale sign went up in their yard. They sold their house at a loss and disappeared. The community began to heal. The new HOA board, led by Frank and with George Henderson as a member, went through the CC&Rs with a fine-tooth comb. They rescinded dozens of the absurd, punitive rules Carol had instituted. They refunded years of improper fines. The atmosphere in Whispering Pines changed. Neighbors started talking to each other again. The annual 4th of July picnic was held for the first time in years, and they asked if they could use my hayfield for parking. I said yes. I am sitting on my porch now. It is a year later. The air has that same autumn chill, but it feels different. It feels peaceful. The gravel on the driveway is smooth and unbroken. The grass where the fence posts were torn out has grown back thick and green. There is no scar. On the small table next to me beside my father's trout mug sits a small framed object. It's the return receipt from the certified letter I sent to Carol. The little green card with her arrogant signature on it. It was the first brick in the wall of facts that ultimately protected this place. David had it framed for me as a joke, but IF kept it. It is a reminder. I've thought a lot about what ownership means. My father owned this land through work and love. He knew its soil, its seasons. I came to own it through a different path, through paper, through process, through the meticulous defense of a line on a map. Carol tried to own it through force of will, through performance and intimidation. She believed that ownership was about power. She was wrong. Ownership, I've come to realize, is not about power. It's about stewardship. And sometimes, stewardship means being a quiet, patient gardener. And sometimes, it means being a quiet, patient lawyer. It means tending to the truth, cultivating the facts, and weeding out the lies. Carol Matheson thought she was building a fence. But all she was really doing was helping me tend my garden. She had no idea that the quiet man in the old ranch house had spent his entire life learning how to do just that. The peace I feel now, the quiet satisfaction of order restored, is the true inheritance my father left me. And it is a property whose boundaries can never be disputed.